Today is the second in this series that some people call the bread sequence that happens in year B of the lectionary. And so we have several weeks where we're going to hear about and think about and talk about bread. Last Sunday, we reflected on the story of Jesus feeding the multitudes in a simple act of generosity. As Dave reminded us this morning, many hungry people were fed. Well, today, those same satisfied people are back again. And they're hungry again. Or at least they want to see Jesus do that multiplication thing again. They want to sit down for another miraculous feast. Witness once again this wonder-working rabbi. Are they clamoring for food? For miracles? Or for something else to satisfy their hunger? Preacher and author Barbara Brown Taylor reflects on hunger and says this: perhaps there is no proof a famine exists except the fact that people are hungry. In the land of plenty, the cause of that hunger can be difficult to diagnose. It's often not until we have tried to ease it with everything else we know that we discover by process of elimination our hunger for God. Jesus is interested in what they're hungry for, in what they seek. Are they looking for one thing when they really need something else entirely? I remember when my son Philip was a young teenager, maybe 13, we would sit down for dinner and he would eat seconds and sometimes thirds and still remain skinny. I just don't get it. But anyway, so he would eat seconds and thirds and clearly be full when dinner was over. 5 minutes later, I would see him go to the refrigerator door and open it. Do you know, you must have had teenage boys, I think particularly more than girls. He could not have been physically hungry. It was just an impossibility. He couldn't have been. But as teenagers do, subconsciously, he's looking for something, hungry for something. So it's complicated with us human beings, this hunger thing, isn't it? Longing in us is complicated. Jesus, of course, fed their bodies. He fed their bodies because he cares about physical hunger. But there's more. And so he identifies their true motives, which I'm sure didn't seem like craziness to them. You're looking for me, Jesus said, because of yesterday's bread, aren't you? But I know that you're looking for something else, too, he seemed to say. Maybe you should be looking for bread that will last, something that will continually feed you, food that satisfies that deeper, gnawing hunger in your souls, food that you, like that little boy on the hillside, may already have within you. Jesus then preaches a sermon in which he tells them that he is the bread of life for which they are looking. He reveals in this sermon something about his own identity and his relationship with God. And then he invites all who hear into that same relationship, that relationship that has the power to feed us and to empower us to live the sort of life that Jesus lived. Jesus' play on words, his speaking of literal and spiritual bread and hunger, tells the truth about being human. That we hunger. We hunger for spiritual food and for spiritual satisfaction in much the same way that we experience physical hunger. We need food daily. Physical food and spiritual food. We need it and look for it expectantly, as if life needs to fulfill this for us. And we seek it as if our lives depend on it. This sermon of Jesus, of course, follows last week's story of the feeding of the multitudes. Jesus' text, as is suggested by the crowd, interestingly, is the Exodus story of manna in the wilderness. Now, it makes sense that the crowd would go there. They connected the incident on the mountainside with the manna of Moses. And here's why. There was an expectation. There's an expectation that was expressed in rabbinic and other early Jewish literature that the second Redeemer, that is, the Messiah, will perform the very same acts as the first Redeemer, that is, Moses. One of those three actions was the provision of manna, the provision of bread from heaven. And so you see, they thought they might have glimpsed the Messiah on that hillside that day. But Jesus does an interesting thing. He turns that expectation. He makes it clear that it wasn't actually Moses who provided manna. Just like we said last week, that Jesus isn't the new food truck. Moses wasn't the old food truck either. Jesus tells them that God is the source. God is the source of the bread of life that will feed. Not Moses, not even himself. Not to be deterred, though, the crowd insisted, demanding yet another sign just to be sure. They wanted the satisfaction, maybe even the ease, of someone else to take care of their basic needs, rather than to consider the deeper longing of their souls, their own need for their own connection with the source of bread and life. They hesitated to eat for themselves the bread of God. Jesus could have had them eating out of his hand, literally. But he had something else better to offer them that day and us this day. He had bread of life to offer them that could sustain them beyond momentary satisfaction. He had bread to give them that once they ate it, they wouldn't depend on being spoon-fed by him or anyone else. It was a bread of connectedness, of relationship. It was the bread of a way of life that could lead them to a deeper caring about others, a deeper security about themselves. Bread that would make them peacemakers, not just following the one who is the Prince of Peace, who would make them justice workers and lovers of God. Jesus encourages them then to work for this bread that endures, to take up the life that he's showing them. He invites them to subscribe to his very own diet, which he'd once described to his followers when they were concerned that he'd missed lunch one too many times. They urged him in that moment, "Rabbi, eat something." But he said to them cryptically, "I have food to eat that you don't know about." This confused them. Surely no one had brought him lunch when they weren't looking. But Jesus explained, "My food is to do the will of the one who sent me." So they ask, "How can we do this will and work of God?" Jesus answered them, "This is the will and work of God for you." Our English translation says that you believe in the one whom God has sent. We're back to John chapter 3, it looks like, to that believing in Jesus thing. We've already encountered this concept in that familiar passage, that most familiar verse that we considered several months ago, the whosoever believes in him part. What did Jesus mean when he said that? Do we simply believe that Jesus lived? Do we consent to some Trinitarian proposition of which Jesus is a part? What is it? Believing in Jesus here implies something more essential, something more about the character of our lives. The Greek word here is pistis, often translated simply as faith. But this word has the distinct connotation of giving evidence or proof of something. So, doing the will of God, Jesus said to them, is to give evidence that God lives in us, to express in our lives the essence of God in the world, just as Jesus does. The Gospel of John offers several images to illustrate this evidence of connection with Jesus, expressions that may help us figure out what it means to believe in Jesus, such as shepherd and sheep, or vine and branches. But here, Jesus makes it a little more intimate by saying to them, "For you, I am the bread of life." Bread, of course, is for eating, isn't it? I am the bread of life implies that we are to take something of Jesus into ourselves so that the nutrients can feed us from the inside out. As we consume bread, any ordinary bread, as we consume it, it becomes one with our bodies, doesn't it? It becomes suddenly inseparable from us. When we spiritually eat the bread that is Christ, we become inseparable from the God who nourishes Jesus and the God who can then nourish us. I'm the bread of life, Jesus says. Feed on me. Take into yourselves this spiritual food, the energy of love itself, so that it lives in you and will continue to sustain you. Jesus' union with God empowered him with divine love and compassion and grace. Jesus invites us into exactly the same thing, to be one with him in the same way. We consume Jesus. Take into ourselves the bread of life, into hearts, minds, bodies, and souls. And as we absorb this into the cells of our bodies and spirits, the very essence of Christ, that divine nature of love and justice and compassion will take root and live in us and through us and become one with us. UCC writer Martin Copenhaver says it like this: "For those who receive Jesus, his life clings to their bones and courses through their veins. He can no more be taken from a believer's soul than last Tuesday's breakfast can be plucked from one's body." Eat the bread that is Christ, the bread of life. Take it into your spiritual self, the core, the center of who you are, and you'll never be hungry, Jesus says. You become part of incarnation. That bread of life then resides in you and becomes bread for the world. Now, I don't think that Jesus was speaking only of what we call the Eucharist here, if he was speaking of that at all. But the language of this sermon draws us to this table where we continue to seek and to ritualize the notion of the bread of life. Bread, nourishment, is necessary every day. Fresh bread for this day, not stale or stored. Give us this day, Jesus prayed, our daily bread. Several years ago, a friend of mine from Texas called and told me something that had happened to her. I knew that she was going through a really tough time, and she sought out her pastor, the Reverend Dr. Joe Hudson. And Joe said, "Now, Deanna, here's what I want you to do. Here's what I think will help you." She said, "I'm not going to exactly tell you to pray, but what I want you to do is sit quietly for 5 minutes a day with Jesus. Not God, not the Spirit. She made that very clear. But I want you to imagine in your mind's eye and in your soul's perception that you are spending 5 minutes a day with Jesus. My friend Deanna called me to tell me how this had changed her life, how it had changed her perspective, how she was able to feed on the presence of Jesus for wisdom, for direction. Feed on Jesus. Let the beauty of incarnation transform you. Look around at all that is God incarnate, all that is the face of Christ. Take and eat. Fill yourselves with the bread of God. An ancient story tells of a monastery that was located near the edge of a deep wood. The monks there were experiencing a spiritual depression of sorts. The abbot himself felt lost, didn't know how to lead or where to turn. The abbot had heard of a hermit, a rabbi who lived in the woods nearby. Though they had never seen the rabbi, the monks felt his spiritual presence. And so, in fear and frustration, the abbot set out through the woods to seek the wisdom and direction of the rabbi. After 2 days' journey, he found the hut where the rabbi lived. The rabbi came out and greeted him, and they spoke of the troubles of the monastery. They spent several days together, laughing and crying, sharing stories and praying. As the abbot was leaving, the rabbi grabbed him by the shoulders and said, "I'm sorry, my friend, I do not know the solution that you seek. But this much I do know. The Messiah is among you." The abbot gasped at these words. He left the hut, walked hurriedly along the long path back to the monastery. The Messiah is one of you? What did he possibly mean? He began to walk faster. His heart was beating harder and harder. When he returned to the monastery, the brothers sensed his excitement and asked what the rabbi had said. The rabbi told me that the Messiah is one of us. The monks were in awe at this revelation. And so they lived as if the Messiah was among them, perhaps in them. As they did, they discovered a new sense of hope in their community, a new direction as they feasted on the very bread of life with each relationship and in each encounter. Word spread. People from surrounding villages gathered to worship with them, and they were fed on the love that flowed among them and from them. They treated each other and they treated their guests with honor and attention, and each was fed on the bread of hope. They had feasted, you see, on the Christ, the bread of life, and they became then bread for the world and for one another. The bread of life, finding the divine image in each face. The bread of life, caring more deeply and offering bread to others. When we eat that bread of life, the same Spirit that lives in Jesus to feed and to love lives in us too. And we become bread for the hungry. We become justice for the poor. We become home for the immigrant and dignity for the outcast. This is the bread of life that satisfies. And so take and eat in your prayer and in your practice and at this table. Take the essence of Jesus into your own essence until you become one with God, until your deep hunger is satisfied with the sustaining bread of life alive in you. This is the bread of life that satisfies. Give us this bread, the crowd says. And Jesus seems to say, come and get it. Come and get it. This is a table of plenty. You'll never be hungry again. That, my friends, is still the invitation. Still the invitation of Jesus. Come and get it. Take and eat. I am the bread of life. It's the substantial stuff of love and hope, the power to make a difference in this world. Amen.